if, buried beneath layers of historical silence and societal discomfort, lies a story so profoundly tragic, so deeply unsettling, that it challenges our understanding of justice, innocence, and the hidden corners of human experience? Imagine a narrative that forces us to confront the darkest aspects of poverty, isolation, and the devastating consequences of systemic neglect. This is not a tale told for shock value, but a somber exploration into a true story, long suppressed, that speaks volumes about the vulnerabilities of the marginalized and the uncomfortable truths of a past often swept under the rug. Today, we delve into the harrowing account behind the title. She was 11 and pregnant, the most inbred girl ever born. Vertical bar, true story buried by the South. Approaching it not with sensationalism, but with a commitment to understanding the complex historical and social forces at play. Our journey begins not with a single individual, but with the broader, often overlooked landscape of rural poverty and isolation in the American South, particularly during the early to mid-20th century. This was a time when vast swaths of the population lived in extreme deprivation, far removed from the advancements and social structures of urban centers. For many, life was a relentless struggle against hunger, disease, and a profound lack of opportunity. Education was a luxury, medical care virtually non-existent, and the reach of formal law and social services was often tenuous at best. In these remote, often forgotten communities, families were forced to rely almost entirely on themselves, creating insular worlds where traditional norms, born of necessity and passed down through generations, often diverged sharply from those of mainstream society. Within these isolated pockets, particularly in regions where geographic barriers like mountains or swamps fostered extreme seclusion, the practice of endogamy, marriage within a small, confined group, was not uncommon. This was rarely a conscious choice driven by malice, but rather a tragic consequence of limited options, cultural tradition, and the sheer impossibility of finding suitable partners outside their immediate kin. Over generations, this practice, while strengthening familial bonds and preserving cultural identity, inadvertently led to a concentration of recessive genetic traits. The scientific understanding of genetics was nascent, and the long-term biological consequences of such practices were largely unknown to those living them. What manifested were often subtle, sometimes profound, physical and cognitive challenges that became tragically normalized within these communities, seen not as medical conditions, but as inherent characteristics of their lineage. This historical context is crucial, for it paints a picture of vulnerability, not culpability. The individuals caught within these circumstances were often victims of their environment, born into a cycle of poverty and isolation that offered few avenues for escape or intervention. The stories that emerged from these hidden corners of America were often met with a mixture of fascination, horror, and a swift desire to bury them, deemed too uncomfortable, too shameful, or too complex for public discourse. Yet, it is precisely in these buried narratives that we find the most poignant lessons about the human condition, the resilience of the spirit, and the urgent need for empathy and understanding when confronting the uncomfortable truths of our collective past. It is against this backdrop of historical neglect and societal silence that the story of an 11-year-old girl, caught in the devastating grip of these circumstances, unfolds, a testament to a reality that the South, and indeed the nation, preferred to forget. It is within this complex and often unforgiving environment that the individual tragedy at the heart of our story unfolds. While specific details of such cases are often obscured by time, privacy concerns, and the deliberate suppression of uncomfortable truths, the patterns of vulnerability and systemic failure are tragically consistent. In communities where isolation was profound and the reach of formal institutions minimal, the lines between family, community, and even basic societal protections often blurred. The absence of external oversight, coupled with deeply ingrained cultural norms, could create a vacuum where the most vulnerable were left exposed. For a child, particularly a girl, growing up in such circumstances, the risks were amplified. Without access to education, comprehensive health care, or even basic awareness of their rights, their world was often confined to the immediate family unit. In environments where genetic conditions were prevalent due to endogamy, the physical and cognitive development of children could be severely impacted, rendering them even more susceptible to exploitation. The very concept of childhood, as understood in broader society, was often non-existent. Children were expected to contribute to the household from a very young age, and their innocence was rarely protected. The systemic factors contributing to such tragic events are multifaceted and deeply rooted. Poverty, first and foremost, was a relentless driver. Families struggling for basic survival often lacked the resources, knowledge, or even the mental bandwidth to protect their children from harm, whether from within or without. The lack of access to proper medical care meant that developmental delays or physical vulnerabilities went undiagnosed and untreated, further isolating individuals. Educational deprivation perpetuated cycles of ignorance, limiting opportunities for critical thinking and awareness of alternative ways of life. Furthermore, the historical context of the American South, with its legacy of racial and economic stratification, played a significant role. While the story at hand may not directly involve racial dynamics, the broader societal structures that permitted and perpetuated extreme poverty and isolation in certain regions created fertile ground for such tragedies. The concept of family secrets was often paramount, particularly in communities that felt judged or misunderstood by the outside world. This intense desire for privacy, while understandable, could inadvertently become a shield behind which abuse and neglect could fester, hidden from the very authorities who might have intervened. In such environments, the concept of consent, particularly for a child, was often tragically absent or profoundly distorted. The power dynamics within isolated family units could be absolute, leaving little room for a child to articulate distress or seek help. The very notion of a most inbred girl ever born speaks to a level of genetic constriction that would have rendered an individual profoundly vulnerable, both physically and cognitively, making them an easy target for exploitation. This was not merely a failure of individual morality, but a devastating consequence of a society that, through neglect and a willful turning away, allowed such conditions to persist in its hidden corners. The silence that followed these events was not just a matter of shame, but a deliberate act of burying a truth too painful, too damning, for the collective conscience to bear. The immediate and long-term impact of such a profound tragedy on the individual at its center is almost unimaginable. For an
Subscribe to my
11-year-old
channel.
girl, already burdened by the physical and cognitive challenges that often accompany extreme inbreeding, the experience of pregnancy and childbirth would have been a traumatic ordeal, leaving indelible scars. Her innocence, already fragile, would have been irrevocably shattered. Her future, already constrained by her environment, would have been further diminished, trapping her in a cycle of victimhood and silence. The child born from such circumstances would also face immense challenges, inheriting not only potential genetic vulnerabilities, but also the social stigma and the weight of a deeply troubled lineage. Their very existence would be a testament to a societal failure, a living embodiment of a truth that many wish to ignore. Beyond the individual, the impact reverberated through the immediate community, albeit often in hushed tones and unspoken understandings. In insular environments, such events, while perhaps not openly discussed, were often known. The collective silence, born of shame, fear, and a desperate desire to maintain the fragile social fabric, became a powerful force of suppression. Outsiders who stumbled upon such truths were often met with hostility, evasion, or a wall of impenetrable silence. The community, in its own way, became complicit in the burial of the truth, not necessarily out of malice, but out of a complex mix of self-preservation, ignorance, and a deeply ingrained distrust of external interference. Attempts to bury or understand these truths have taken various forms throughout history. In some cases, official records were deliberately obscured or destroyed, making it nearly impossible to trace lineages or document the full extent of the genetic consequences. In others, the stories were simply allowed to fade into the realm of local folklore, whispered legends that lost their factual basis over time, becoming cautionary tales rather than documented historical events. The societal discomfort with topics like incest, genetic deformities, and child exploitation meant that mainstream media and academic institutions often shied away from in-depth investigation, preferring to maintain a polite distance from such unpleasant realities. However, despite these efforts at suppression, the truth, in its own way, always finds a path to the surface. Dedicated researchers, social workers, and historians, driven by a commitment to justice and understanding, have painstakingly pieced together fragments of these narratives, often facing immense resistance and ethical dilemmas. Their work, while challenging, is crucial. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that such tragedies were not isolated anomalies, but often symptoms of deeper systemic issues of poverty, lack of education, inadequate healthcare, and the failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members. Understanding these buried truths is not about assigning blame to individuals, but about learning from the past, acknowledging the profound human cost of neglect, and ensuring that such stories, however painful, are never truly forgotten, so that the lessons they hold can finally be learned.